So today we're going to be talking about the Vietnam War, and this is chapter 17 in your book. And so what we have to do is we have to look at what started the issue. And so here we are in the section 1, the U.S. focuses on Vietnam. And you see a map there to your right, and those arrows in the purple show you who's in charge of which area when we get into this particular conflict. A quick look at Vietnam's history. France controlled the area, and it was called Indochina in the 18th century. Japan took control during World War II. With U.S. funding, France attempted to recolonize the area after World War II. The French lost control to Ho Chi Minh. You see his picture there to the right, and the Viet Minh forces in 1954, and Dien Bien Phu. So then you can read the next part. President Eisenhower, who was our president after the war, declined to intervene on behalf of France. At the International Conference at Geneva, Vietnam was divided at the 17th parallel of latitude, and Ho Chi Minh's nationalist forces controlled the north, and Ngo Diem, the French-educated Roman Catholic, claimed the south area. Growth of Vietnamese nationalism. The Vietnamese were tired of outside forces controlling their government, as would we all feel that way of China, Japan, and France. A leader of the nationalist movement, Nguyen Tat Thanh, had been educated and an advocate of communism. His name became Ho Chi Minh, a bright bringer of light. He organized at the Viet Minh. See a typo there. So the U.S., not wanting the spread of a communistic ideology, decided to support the French. So after Japan lost to the U.S. in World War II, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam independent, as you would if you're Vietnamese, but France still wanted control of that area for trade purposes and money. Ho Chi Minh to launch a revolution in Vietnam in the mid-40s because he wanted to win Vietnam's independence from colonial authority. The U.S. went back and forth with its support, but because Ho Chi Minh represented communism, they ultimately supported France and South Vietnam. The domino theory, if Vietnam fell to communism and so would the rest of the area, impacted the U.S.'s involvement. Defeat of Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, French commander controlled the city. The Viet Minh bombed the French to defeat by May 7th, 1954, and then France left Vietnam. Geneva Accords. Now, these are very important because the meetings were held to negotiate peace. Before this, Vietnam was a part of French Indochina, so Vietnam and Cambodia, that area. After this, the French left Vietnam, but the U.S. moved in. Diem was the leader of the South. By 1956, Vietnam was headed towards a civil war, which is a war within the country. So that gives you the primary focus of section 1. We're going to go on to section 2 here, which is going to war with Vietnam. There's some graphic images during the Vietnam War, and so be prepared with what you're going to see. One of those is the picture to the right. Kennedy takes over. Kennedy is John F. Kennedy. Wanting to look tough on communism after taking office in 1961, Kennedy increased troop numbers in Vietnam from 2,000 to 15,000. The overthrow of Diem. He is the leader of the South. He was becoming more and more unpopular. Ho Chi Minh, on the other hand, was becoming very popular. He banned Buddhism because he was Catholic. His police killed 9 people, and a Buddhist monk set himself on fire. The picture to the right. Diem was executed on November 1st of 1963. 3 weeks later, JFK was assassinated, and South Vietnam was unstable after Johnson became president. He was deeply against communism, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Now, this is a huge deal because what it does, on August 2nd, 1964, Johnson announced attacks on U.S. boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. Though Johnson, a Democrat, in 1964, Congress passed this resolution to take necessary measures to repel any armed attack against U.S. forces. So what happened was Congress gave Johnson the power to basically do whatever he wanted to militarily without being checked by Congress. So those checks and balances that are typically there were now gone with the Gulf of Tonkin. So he had more power to fight in Vietnam. This gave the power of war to the president. The United States sends troops. He sent combat troops into the conflict, increased attacks on American bases in 1964 by Viet Cong. Because of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, Johnson responded with airstrikes. By March of 1965, Johnson expanded the American involvement with sustained bombing. This was called Operation Rolling Thunder. So you can see how absolutely far away Vietnam is from us. The bloody stalemate emerges. Johnson kept sending troops, 180,000 in 65, 350,000 in 66. Frustrating warfare. The Viet Cong lacked the superior firepower of the U.S., but made up for it with ambush, booby traps, and guerrilla tactics. The Viet Cong blended with the general population, and the Americans retaliated with search and destroy missions. To destroy the environment that hid the Viet Cong, the U.S. used napalm and Agent Orange. We're going to show you that a little bit closer up in just a little bit. So the draft is also called conscription, and some of you might have remembered this from other wars. During the Vietnam War, about 2/3 of American troops were volunteered. The rest were selected for military service through the drafts. At the beginning of the war, names of all American men of draft age were collected by the selective service system. When someone's name was called, he had to report to his local draft board, which was made of various community members, so that they would begin to evaluate his draft status. The average age of the soldier was 19 compared to the average age of the soldier in World War II being 26. Remember, I told you we were going to look a little closer at Agent Orange and napalm, and so you can see some of these, I guess you can call them a type of chemical warfare going on here. Among the most devastating explosives used in U.S. and South Vietnamese bombing runs was napalm, a chemical compound developed during World War II. When mixed with gasoline and included an incendiary bombs or flamethrowers, napalm could be propelled at greater distances than gasoline and release large amounts of carbon monoxide when it exploded, poisoning the air and causing even greater damage than traditional bombs. Determined enemy. There is no greater danger than underestimating your opponent. So I looked that up because that seems exactly what happened in Vietnam, which is what the U.S. did just as England had underestimated the Patriots in the Revolution. North Vietnam supplied their troops using Ho Chi Minh Trail through Cambodia and Laos. The USSR and China were also supplying the Viet Cong. Johnson placed limits on the war with not fully allowing the U.S. to close off the trail to invade North Vietnam. In other words, fully allowing them to close it off would mean going into 2 other countries, and Johnson didn't want to do that. Though 220,000 Vietnamese died in 2 years, they kept fighting. Agent Orange, you could see there, was a powerful mixture of chemical defoliants used by U.S. military during the Vietnam War to eliminate forest cover of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops, as well as the crops that might be used to feed them. So obviously, if they are being getting rid of the jungle, there's no place for people to hide. So this takes us to section 3. Vietnam divides the nation. What an understatement, as printed in our book. A growing credibility gap. 66% of Americans approved of the policy in the Vietnam by 1965. General William Westmoreland kept reporting that the enemy was almost defeated, but because reporters were covering the war on TV, Americans actually saw the dead and wounded. An anti-war movement emerges. As the number of dead Americans increased, support decreased. Obviously, teach-ins begin. By May 1965, 122 colleges held the national teach-in. Sorry, there's a typo there. By radio for more than 100,000 anti-war demonstrators. Many felt the U.S. should not have Americans die so far away in something that did not concern them. Remember, I showed you the picture, how far away it was. Anger at the draft. Some felt that it wasn't equal treatment. College students could defer going, but low-income men that were not in college were drafted. 20% of American death combats were African American, while they only made up 10% of the population in the United States. This obviously angered African American leaders because of the disproportionate number of African American soldiers in Vietnam. This was a difficult fight because the civil rights movement was also taking place, and African Americans were finding a place in the military. Some men refused to be drafted, so they burned their draft cards and even moved to Canada. They were called draft dodgers. The 26th Amendment came out at this time. The argument was, if I can go to war at 18, why can I not vote for the person sending me? Also in section 3, we see the explanation of the hawks and the doves. The hawks are the war hawks, the people that support the war and increase involvement. The doves were the peace supporters that wanted out and wanted to stop fighting. And you can see a graphic picture of that to the right there. Graphic in the meaning that it's not bad to look at, but it shows you a hawk and a dove. and the Vietnam dispute. In 1968, it is a pivotal year. 2 assassinations, Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, also known as RFK. The Tet Offensive also happened in January 30th, 1968, when the North Vietnamese attacked all American air bases in South Vietnam. In the city of Hue in South Vietnam, the communists massacred 3,000 people and put them in mass graves. The South Vietnamese and U.S. troops repelled the enemy. The American people were shocked that the Tet Offensive could happen, and the North Vietnamese were supposed to be on the brink of defeat. This showed a credibility gap. So credibility gap is when we think the government is not telling us the truth. Due to this, there was only a 32% approval rating of President Johnson. So Johnson leaves the presidential race. And Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota and President Robert F. Kennedy decide to run against Johnson as Democrats for president. By March 31st of 1968, though, Johnson said he would not run for re-election. His approval rating was down due to the war and how he was handling it. The other candidates looked better at this time. He did not know that Bobby Kennedy would be assassinated a few months later, and really Bobby Kennedy was kind of in the lead. The season of violence. So MLK was assassinated 8 days after Johnson made the announcement, and Robert Kennedy was assassinated June 5th in Los Angeles at the Democratic National Convention. Violence broke out as well with anti-war protesters. The Democrats chose a man named Hubert Humphrey as their candidate. RFK probably would have won, but he had been killed. Nixon, the Republican, though, wins that presidency. The violence of the Democrats undermined them in 1968 election, and a third-party candidate, George Wallace, an independent, was a Southern segregationist, meaning separation of races. Nixon promised to end the war. He beat Humphrey by 100 electoral votes. The war winds down. Section 4. Nixon moves to end the war. He appointed Henry Kissinger, look at the picture to the right, who embarked on a linkage, improved relations with USSR, and started peace talks with North Vietnam. By 1969, Kissinger was in secret talks with Lee Duc Tho. Meanwhile, Nixon cut back troops and withdrawal troops known as Vietnamization. He did increase airstrikes in North Vietnam and Viet Cong safe zones in Cambodia, which is a different country, which causes a little bit of turmoil. So at home, it continues. Even with Vietnamization, protests continued. And here's a big reason, the massacre at My Lai. So March 16th, 1968, Johnson was president this time when American troops massacred 200 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians in My Lai. There's a picture to the right. There is a more graphic description of these crimes if you research it, and I'm not going to put it in here. Lieutenant William Cawley was in charge. Initially, there was a cover-up of these crimes that were committed. Cawley was the only soldier charged in the crime, and the others felt they were following his order. The invasion of Cambodia sparks protest. So Nixon and troops invade Cambodia to flush the Viet Cong out. Well, many Americans felt that this was expanding the war and not reducing it, so students began to protest at university campuses. At Kent State, our own National Guard fired into the crowd, killing 4 students. And then 2 African-American students were killed at Jackson State College in Mississippi. There are some of those images to the bottom. The Nixon and Kissinger team shared a global vision for U.S. foreign policy with scaled-back military commitments overseas. Although Nixon and Kissinger wanted the U.S. to continue playing a central role in international politics, they did not want to further commit the United States to the type of military operations that had caused such problems in North Korea and Vietnam. The Pentagon Papers. The invasion of Cambodia angered Congress, who did not know about it. They repealed, which means to take back that Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave Johnson so much power in Vietnam. The former employee of the Defense Department leaked the Pentagon paper to the New York Times. These documents showed that President Johnson was not being honest about the war. I don't know that he cared as much because he was gone by then. The U.S. pulls out of Vietnam. By 1971, 2/3 of Americans wanted to end the war. Though people wanted to end the war, many Americans were tired of the war protesters as well and voted Republican back into office in 1972. So the two sides, North and South Vietnam, kind of reached a little bit of a peace agreement. Peace negotiations broke down, and so Nixon began the most destructive air raids called the Christmas bombing for 12 straight days. And by January, North Vietnam agreed to sign the agreement with peace with South Vietnam. But if you look at those dates there, within 2 years, South Vietnam falls to North Vietnam. After the U.S. had pulled out of the South Vietnam, the North invaded. Nixon had promised support if anything happened, but he had resigned over something we call Watergate, which we will discuss in the next chapter. Ford could not convince Congress to give him money to go back to South Vietnam. Thus, The city of Saigon fell and became communist and is now known as Ho Chi Minh City. Americans began to evacuate the city, and Saigon fell before the communists. Operation Frequent Wind was the largest helicopter evacuation ever. When you look it up, it's pretty fascinating. They actually had to throw helicopters into the ocean just to clear the decks to land more helicopters on the aircraft carriers. The legacy of Vietnam. The war's human toll, it cost well over $170 billion in direct costs, and then there were the indirect expenses of covering, healthcare for these 58,000 Americans that died, or the 300,000 that were injured, plus many psychological problems that followed the soldiers home. The war's impact on the nation. The Wars Power Act was passed and Congress to limit presidential involvement in military actions. And then Nixon's foreign policy successes included the opening of American relations with China. And you can actually see pictures of President Nixon in China there. It was actually a big deal. An event that marked Nixon's trip to the country in 1972. Using his impeccable credentials as an anti-communist as leverage, Nixon determined that negotiations with China would not only benefit American economy, but would also force the Soviets to be more conciliatory towards the United States. So what we have here now are a lot of veterans coming home. Remember, 300,000 people alone were injured, plus all the people returning home. The nation learned all of the following lessons in the Vietnam War experience. Veterans suffer with their sacrifices in war go unrecognized. After the massacre and My Lai, Americans were critical of Vietnam veterans and treated them poorly. Some even called them baby killers. It was important for the executive and legislative branches of government to have the proper checks and balances in matters of war. So that's why they passed the War Powers Act. And foreign policy consideration is necessary before intervening in the affairs of another nation. So the final slide that we have here is the summary of the war. And what we have here is the very beginning of it, the roots of the conflict, the full-scale war, and at the same time of the full-scale war is the opposition of the war happening, and then the end of the war and what happened. And you can look at that slide there.